Saturday. I'm glad you all made it. And welcome to the Goffstown Public Library. I don't know if this is anyone's first time here, but this floor is our fiction section, so welcome. If you have any questions, my name is Natalie, and I'm the Technical Services Librarian here. I'm filling in today for Caroline, who some of you might know. She's our Adult Services Librarian. And I'm here today to introduce Leah Dearborn, who is going to talk about her book about Grenier Air Base. She is the Associate Director of the Aviation Museum of New Hampshire, which is located in Londonderry. And she's going to talk a bit about that in case anyone's interested in visiting. She has degrees in journalism and international relations, and she has written for newspapers across New England. And this is her book, and I'm very excited to hear all about this amazing research that she's done. So thank you all again for coming out, and just a few housekeeping things. If you could silence your cell phones, that would be great. The restrooms are on the first floor, so the stairs are right out here to the left, and then there is an elevator some of you may have taken. That's if you go straight down this hall to the right. And if you need anything else, I'll be right in that corner over there. So thank you. Welcome, Leah.
Would you mind taking a quick photo or two for the museum social media? Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Great. Thank you everybody for coming out today. If you ever can't hear me, just give a little wave and I'll try to speak up. But my name's Leah Dearborn, and as she just mentioned, I'm the Associate Director of the Aviation Museum of New Hampshire. We are located, if anyone hasn't been there, could I see a show of hands? Who has visited our museum? Thank you. But if you haven't been there, we are actually this building right here. Whoop. Made it angry. Okay, there we go. And we're a museum, but we're also a 501c3 nonprofit. So we do historical research, we have museum exhibits. You might see some World War II era exhibits in our museum, but we also do a lot of programming to help kids get involved in STEM and aviation in the present day. So the proceeds of this book entirely go to our programming, such as our school outreach. We are building 3 aircraft in high schools across the state, and every time we sell a copy of this book, it goes directly into that. I am going the wrong way. That's why it's not working. So what is this project? The project was something that the museum envisioned a few years ago. We are located on the site of what used to be Grenier Air Force Base, which was located at today's Manchester-Boston Regional Airport. The lifetime of that base was brief. It was only 27 years. It broke ground in 1939, and it came to a close in 1966 when the Air National Guard relocated to Pease out on the seacoast. If you walk around the area today, you'll see near our museum, it's mostly sort of an industrial park area. There's nothing that really remains that would tell you that this was a large military installation during the height of the Second World War and into the Cold War. And here's a photo of it from its heyday. A little bit about the research. A lot of the time, I think when people envision writing a book, you think about sitting alone in an enclosed space and typing out what you're thinking. This book was really not written in isolation. It was written as a consequence of a lot of people coming into my office, telling me family stories, coming up to me at events like this, pulling from our volunteer community for connections in the area. So it really was very much a community effort to write this book and to fundraise to publish it. But I did also use some more formal sources. There is a guide called Air Force Combat Units of World War II by someone named Maurer. It was written in the 80s. It's the most comprehensive list I could find of combat or tactical groups and where they were stationed during the Second World War. And that resource names 21 groups that were active at Grenier. But what I found from talking to people is that it really isn't comprehensive. there are many instances, and I just talked to someone before this lecture began, where a crew flew in, spent a night or two at Grenier, and as far as I can tell, there was never a real record of it anywhere that exists any longer. And the only way you can find out that information is by oral storytelling. Another way I wrote this was through newspaper clippings, letters, archival documents, and particularly from our archive, there were these massive binders of newspaper clippings, and they were stamped Grenier Air Force Base. And what they were was somebody in the height of the 1940s, when the war was ongoing, at least this is what it clearly seems to me, was taking pretty meticulous care every time a soldier from New Hampshire went missing or got a promotion or was taken prisoner of war and it made the news. Somebody was clipping these out and saving the files. And this is the compilation of those files. So that was a major resource for me as well. I also was lucky enough to come across this at the Manchester Historic Association. They received an anonymous donation of a very large photo album which contained clips from the Manchester Union leader, but also a lot of high quality photographs. They told me that it had been dropped off on their doorstep by somebody in a trash bag shortly before I started the research on this, and they didn't know who it belonged to. My guess is that it was somebody who worked for the Manchester Union leader as a photographer, and it was their clip file. So basically there would be like, you'd see these photos on one page, and then on the next page you would see where they were printed in a story in the newspaper. But this was also a useful resource. So why was the base called Grenier? It dates back to this young man who you can see here on the right. His name was Lieutenant Jean Donat Grenier, or Grenier. He came from a large West Side family in Manchester, and he became embroiled indirectly with the airmail scandal of the 1930s. Basically, to keep it kind of succinct, in the 1930s, mail was being delivered commercially by private airlines. And it came out that there was some potential, and I think even to this day there's some back and forth about whether this was true, that these airlines were receiving their commission based on how it impacted the personal pockets and the stock portfolios of politicians of the day. Kind of tale as old as time. So basically, politicians getting a kickback for giving certain airlines preferential treatment. To try to address this, the administration in power decided that they were going to move the process of delivering the mail to the military. And when I first heard this, I thought, well, that sounds not impossible. Like, that sounds kind of reasonable, right? Like, the military should be capable of delivering mail. But the problem was there was pressure on the military to do this very quickly. So they were asked to take on this role within a span of weeks to deliver across the continent. And they were doing so mainly with pilots who had very limited training, who were very new pilots, flying in planes without instruments, without cockpits, or without, they were not enclosed cockpits, and they were flying in some of the worst weather conditions in many decades in the middle of winter. So when you combine all of those factors together, it was a recipe for disaster. And unfortunately, one of the people who paid the price for that was Jean Grenier. And I have a little passage to read about him. The story of Grenier Air Base's name begins far away from Manchester, New Hampshire, in a swirl of heavy fog and snow near Oakley, Utah, in February of 1934. George Sidaway and his two young sons were cutting wood in Weber Canyon in the northern part of the state when they heard the distinctive roar of an airplane engine, not yet a commonplace sound. Sidaway later recalled hearing the propeller as though its blades were revolving close to the ground, but the plane remained a phantom obscured in the fog. Sidaway and most of the residents of Oakley reported hearing the plane, but no one could see more than 50 to 75 feet away in the poor weather. "That ship is lost," Sidaway commented soberly to his sons. The noise of the propeller soon stopped altogether. On a peaceful ranch pasture nearby, normally reserved for grazing sheep, 2 Army Air Corps officers lost their lives when their Curtiss A Shrike hit the ground at high speed, plowing through snow and 2 feet of earth. The force of the impact caused the plane to telescope, according to reporting by the Salt Lake City Tribune, and crushed the 24-year-old pilot, Lieutenant Jean-Donat Grenier of Manchester, between the engine and the reserve gas tank. An attempt by 10 men to remove his body was unsuccessful. The wreckage was crushed together so tightly that a team of horses had to rip the plane apart to extract the 2 victims. The bodies of Grenier and Lieutenant Edwin White, 23, who had been positioned in the rear seat, were transported off-site by bobsled, then eventually to Salt Lake City by funeral car. Grenier was buried in Mount Calvary Cemetery on the west side of Manchester. He was survived by a large Quebecois family who mourned the young man's loss so deeply their grief had ripple effects throughout the decades since and into the present day. The skies of the early 1930s were a still largely untouched realm, fostering a sense of daring and innovation that fueled what would come to be known as the golden age of aviation. But with innovation comes risk, and mechanized flight was just over 30 years old in 1934. Not enough time to effectively minimize the dangers in a completely new method of travel that took pilots and passengers thousands of feet into the air where there was little room for error. So, as you can see, it didn't go well. And that is actually the pin held by the Manchester Historical Association today that belonged to Grenier. When later in the 1930s, along the eastern seaboard, the Department of Defense was starting to shore up its defensive positions in preparation for conflict that was beginning to brew overseas. And when Manchester was eventually selected as the site of this base, and it came to a vote who it should be named after, there were local politicians in the mix, but Grenier was the unanimous pick. And Grenier was picked to be at this site for a couple different reasons. I've talked to a few historians in the area who believe some of it was a little bit of personal politics. There was a gentleman involved with the town, with the city, who was friendly with the people who were making these decisions. But I think the main impetus for it was really that it was ideally situated geographically, so it was close to the coast in the case of a coastal attack, but it wasn't so close that it would be the immediate target of that attack, so people could scramble and respond. But it was also well situated because it's one of the most northeastern corners of the country, so it was an ideal route for the bombers to go up. They would typically go up over Canada, Labrador, Newfoundland, or Greenland, onto Scotland, and then once they arrived in Scotland would often train or truck down to more southern England and then on to the European theater of combat. A number of troops did also go from Grenier to North Africa, to the North African theater. But at the height of the war in the 1940s, 400 tactical aircraft were arriving per month. 51,000 crew members trained at Grenier. So for something that is non-existent today, that's quite a few people moving through there. And I've seen government figures that place about 1,200 New Hampshire World War II casualties as a result of that conflict. I think that is likely a very low number based on even just the newspaper clippings I've seen, but I think there are a lot of unrecorded deaths to this day. And I think there's a lot of people who may have had, maybe they were born in New Hampshire, but they lived partly in Massachusetts and they were drafted from there. Either way, I think probably considerably more. At the outset of World War II, flying was still fairly new. This was a new technology at this point. The Air Force at that point was known as the Army Air Force, and it hadn't separated out from the Army yet, but was undergoing major structural changes and a massive expansion effort. In just 6 years, the strength of the U.S. Army Air Forces would rise from 26,500 men and 2,200 aircraft in 1939 to over 2 million men and women and over 60,000 aircraft in 1945. So that is a massive expansion. One of the numbered air forces that were born of this whole restructuring effort was the 8th Air Force, which some of you may be familiar with that name, known as the Mighty 8th, which would go on to become the largest air armada in the world, capable of sending more than 2,000 heavy bombers and over 1,000 fighter planes on a single mission, but started out as just 7 men without any aircraft in Savannah, Georgia. And many members of the 8th Air Force transited through Grenier for their final training before going overseas. And a funny thing I found out while I was writing this book, I contacted the 8th Air Force Museum down in Savannah, Georgia. I contacted the Wasp Museum in Sweetwater, Texas, the World War II Museum in New Orleans, which is huge. I contacted the Smithsonian, the New England Air Museum, Presque Isle, like the town, the Historical Society, anyone I could find. I contacted the North Atlantic Air Museum. Of these places, there was almost absolutely nothing that they had in their archives about Grenier. At best, I got like a telegraph that was about a page and some aerial maps that we already had in our own archives. So despite everything that I just told you about over 50,000 men transiting through Grenier and this very storied group of individuals who also trained here, there really isn't one great source that I was able to pull data from this from. So you might have already put this together, but when there is a colossal expansion effort, such as what the military saw in the years of World War II, where you're going from only a couple thousand aircraft to over 60,000, there's going to be some accidents. And that happened on Grenier as well as across the country at the time. I've heard the training grounds for veterans of air combat in World War II as being an additional front that nobody talks about. Or they do, but it's, I think, not really discussed all that much. For instance, the Army Air Corps lost over 4,500 in actual combat against Japanese armed forces, but 7,100 in training accidents in the US. There were over 6,350 fatal air accidents across the US during World War II, resulting in the deaths of over 15,000 pilots, crew members, and bystanders. And the number of air accidents that happened around Grenier were something that came up again and again when I talked to people about what they remembered from the base. I talked to particularly a lot of people who were kids when this base was functional, because for the most part, that's who's still with us, people who were very young during the war. And sometimes they would have stories about, because they were children, it's not like they were being super morbid or anything, they were just curious. So they would get on their bike, and if they heard there was an accident, they would ride out to it and see if they could pick up a little souvenir. And in one case, a child found this weird kind of football-shaped thing from one of the accidents near Grenier, took it home, and a few days later the military police showed up and talked to his mom and said, "Ma'am, have you seen this item?" And she said, "Oh yeah, Billy's been playing with that for a week, here it is." It turns out what he was playing with was a Norden bomb sight. If you don't know what the Norden bomb sight is, it's before the advent of World War II, there were a couple competing bomb sight manufacturers. But before then, if you were dropping a bomb or an incendiary device out of a plane, you had to just kind of guess where it was going to go. Not the most effective tactic for waging warfare. You want to know, I'm going to hit this target. So there's a popular book called The Bomber Mafia out right now by Malcolm Gladwell. You can read all about this particular story, but some people say this device changed the history of warfare. It was super top secret, it was under lock and key on the base, and if you were on a crew with one of these Norden bomb sites and the ship was going down, you were ordered to destroy it. Take a hammer, take a gun, do whatever you can to keep it from getting into enemy hands. And this little kid found it and he played with it for a week and had a good time. It was not only men on the base, there were a lot of women serving as well. They were Army nurses or they were WACs, Women's Army Corps. They came into existence through an action by Edith Norse Rogers, a congresswoman from Massachusetts, who introduced the first bill to establish a women's auxiliary in May 1941. And you can see these women on Grenier right here. And in the course of writing this book, I found a couple of interesting WACs who had their careers start at Grenier. And one of them was Babs, or Barbara Keith, and her sister Irene Keith. And Barbara Keith started out, she was just a teenager, so she's very young in that photo, and she was an illustrator, and she would illustrate and do like little fun political cartoons for the base on the newspaper. And her sister Irene actually got her own pilot's license, and you can see her filling up a P-51 Mustang there. But it started a pretty impressive career for Barbara. She went from doing the cartoons for the base newspaper on Grenier to, she was then requested for her services in Washington, D.C., where she was asked to take aerial photographs that were taken over battlefields and to create them together and illustrate invasion illustrations for planning battles. And she went on to have a storied career that included, she would draw samples from the lunar mission for the first NASA missions to the moon. And later on, she also worked on the Chappaquiddick trial as a courtroom illustrator, but it all started back at Grenier. And the really funny thing about this was I found out about her because I was in the museum's sort of musty archives, and I found this newspaper that mentioned her and her sister from, I think it was 1943, and probably no one had looked at it in decades. And I put it away thinking, like, I wonder if she has any living relatives. She sounds like she had a pretty interesting life. What did she do after this? And then the next day, I got a phone call, and it was from a man named Keith Gibbons, and it was her son, which is incredible to me. And he had heard that I was doing this project, and he wanted to reach out, because it turns out in her very, very late years, one of the things that she really wanted to do was return to the site of Grenier and visit our museum, which is there today. And she did get a chance to do that. But Irene, her sister, trained as a civilian mechanic before being transferred to Westover and then on to Missouri. And because she had her pilot's license, although she was not a WASP, which you may have heard of, the WASPs were female pilots who were tasked with transferring the bombers from base to base. She didn't do that, but she would sometimes kind of covertly get a shot behind the controls of military aircraft. The man in this photo is a man named Thomas Kelly, and he is a great example of how family stories influenced how I wrote this book. And also about sort of the collective nature of history and storytelling. And I'm going to read you just a quick section about Thomas Kelly. He is the uncle of one of our museum docents, a man named Dan Kelly, and his entire family served in the military. He himself did, his father, his uncle, his brother, but Thomas Kelly in particular had a connection back to Grenier. Another individual caught up in the intercontinental spiderweb of air crews who readied for combat at Grenier Air Force Base was Corporal John Thomas Kelly. His logbook entry from December 28, 1944 read, "Left Lincoln, Nebraska at night in a blizzard and landed next morning at Grenier Field. Most of the flight was made in instrument conditions. At Grenier, we were processed and ready for a trip across the Atlantic." 5 days later, the crew lifted off for Goose Bay, Labrador, from which they then moved on to Iceland, Wales, and finally to England. The trip would take over a month in miserable weather conditions. Thomas Kelly, uncle of Aviation Museum docent Dan Kelly, served his first of 31 missions on February 19, 1945 over Germany, on a B-17 Flying Fortress. Victory in Europe Day was only a few months away, but no one fighting in the skies over Europe would have guessed that. The ferocity of the German defense was startling, even in the last days of the war. In March, the Germans were fighting through their own flak, which Dan Kelly likened to running through an active target range. It was crazy, just a real fur ball. Planes everywhere, flak everywhere. He commented in an interview about his uncle's service as an engineer and flight mechanic in the 545th Bomb Squad Heavy. On that first mission, Thomas Kelly's number 2 engine was knocked out by flak. German jets were able to get within about 800 yards of his aircraft, but their guns appeared to jam and they peeled off. The other German jets were scared off by P-51 Mustangs, the legendary fighters of World War II, who flew the B-17s as escorts. Thomas Kelly would later write in his logs, "Those P-51s are handy little guys to have around." On other occasions, his meticulous flight logs would refer to the P-51s as guardian angels watching over us, and many P-51s also trained at Grenier. Dan Kelly said his uncle never talked about the entries detailed in his logbook, but he did talk about his love of the P-51. He really felt that airplane saved his life. It wasn't just the P-51 that got Thomas Kelly through the war in one piece, however. On one mission, 2nd Lieutenant William C. Murphy saved his life twice. Murphy had ordered his crew to bail out of their B-17, which was hit and going down. Everyone else was already gone from the plane. Thomas Kelly walked to his station to bail out when Murphy, the pilot, suddenly threw his kneeboard at him and started to frantically motion for him to come up to the cockpit. At that point, Thomas Kelly saw that his parachute was on fire. Murphy told him, "Strap your ass in, we're going to ditch this son of a bitch." And they did. Thanks to Murphy's flying skills, they ditched safely in the English Channel, where the British Air Sea Rescue found them, probably after sighting the smoke coming from their damaged engines. They were pulled out of the frigid waters just as their plane, nicknamed the Purple Pup, slipped between the waves to the channel's bottoms. Jay Kelly, Dan's cousin, said of his father, who was Thomas, and comrades, "They were certainly brave men. It's kind of a miracle I'm even here." And those are just sort of the stories you get that you would never ever know from just reading the dry sort of military histories or records. But by talking to people, sometimes today even still, with all the time that's gone by, you can get a little taste of. But the military records are also an important piece of this, because Thomas Kelly, his nephew told me, was deeply haunted by one particular air raid where he witnessed one of the planes in his squadron go down into a tailspin, and he assumed his whole life that the whole crew had died. And I decided to do a little research into this. I found the missing aircrew report that detailed exactly what happened in that accident, because I was able to track through his logs the day it had happened. It turns out not everyone on the crew died. There was one man who landed on a rooftop, survived, and the woman who lived in the building, actually, who was a German woman, protected him from angry farmers and made sure he got to safety. And later on, when he was interviewed about his experience by the US government, he made sure to say, "If you have any way to get in touch with her, please let her know she saved my life." So, I don't know, Grenier was this sort of starting place. It was sort of the center of this web where people kind of went off and had all kinds of experiences, both horrific and some also very courageous. While a lot of men and women were leaving Grenier, at the end of the war, it also became a place where they were all coming back to. And it was where the first C-54 bearing wounded troops from the invasion of Normandy during D-Day came back to, because it was one of the most northeastern bases in the country. And here you can see a photograph of one of the nurses tending the men there. The wounded soldiers' memories of the flaming Normandy beachhead in their minds were tenderly and carefully removed from the evacuation plane and driven in ambulances to the station hospital. And that was described in the base newspaper. Soldiers were given cigarettes, shaving razors, newspapers, anything to make them more comfortable before they were then transported on to larger hospitals. And you can kind of see this in a lot of the news of the day, excitement over the airmen arriving back home. I thought this was really interesting. As I was researching this, I kept finding photos of men coming back and receiving cups of milk. I didn't know what that was, and I just kind of marked it in my head as like, oh, that's interesting. And after I gave one of these talks at a retirement community, a gentleman came up to me at the end and said, I used to live near Bradley Air Base, and I was a kid at the end of the war, and all the men were coming back. And one thing that I remember was that the Red Cross gave them all a cup of milk. And he said it was because when they were overseas, they didn't have access to dairy for the most part for the duration of the war due to shortages. So when they came back, they were being given like a little cup of milk as sort of a treat or a thank you, which I guess makes more sense when you take it in that context. After the war, Grenier did begin to wind down for a period. It was still operational as a base, but it became quieter because you didn't have this mass influx of troops going in and out. One story I got from the 1950s came from the point of view of Ruth Mattingly, who is on the right. She is still with us today. She is in her 90s, and she was very enthusiastic about talking about the careers of her and her sister Vicky on the left. And what they wanted to do was, Ruth was very set on buying a car as a teenager, and she did not have nearly enough money. She had this kind of wake-up moment where she realized, oh, that's much more expensive than I can afford. And so she went out and she got a job, at first as a typist, got pretty bored with that, turned to her sister Vicky one day and said, I think we should join the military. And so they both did. They both joined the Air Force, which is what it was called at that point in time. And initially they had their sights set on being sort of like high-level attendants to generals on planes, but quickly kind of realized that was a bit of a pie-in-the-sky ambition. They ended up being aerial photographers, and they were transferred out west. But during one mission, they were given the opportunity to fly back east for a visit to come back home for a little bit. And Grenier was the closest base to their home, which was out on Plum Island at the time. And so the two of them in the 1950s had a perfect view of Grenier from the bomb bay of a B-29, which I can't imagine what that experience must have been like. A B-29 towards the end of the war was the largest military aircraft in existence. So it must have been this like huge behemoth, but to them it was a little terrifying because Ruth was flying over in the bomb bay, so she could just see the whole world spanning out beneath her and all of Grenier. But she is emphatic that her choice to join the military, including her brief stint at Grenier, really opened up the world for her. And to this day, as she kind of nears the end of her life, it's something that she is enormously proud of. This man right here, his name is Major Carl Stinson. And in the 50s and into the early 60s, Grenier became a place where Civil Air Patrol cadets would train, especially in the summers. They would have encampments there. Civil Air Patrol began during the war, and the purpose of their organization as sort of an auxiliary group to the Air Force was you had all these men and these planes and these resources who had to go over to the theater of combat overseas. But there was also the issue of what was happening in the North Atlantic. So there were a lot of German submarines who were coming very, very close to land. And I did speak to a number of living veterans of World War II who recalled actually seeing them come up from the water in Dorchester Harbor, and that's how close they were. So submarines and what was happening in the North Atlantic was a big concern. The Civil Air Patrol arose as an organization where civilian flyers could use their own planes, sometimes strapping bombs to them, to go out and do submarine patrols. It was their way of doing sort of a public service. And they are on record as actually, they did manage to sink a German sub at least once. And this is remarkable because these are kids for the most part. Even today, some of them were very, very young, so they were teenagers, but they were also people who were too old to serve in the military but really wanted to do something for their country. I found one newspaper article detailing the oldest Civil Air Patrol participant during the war as being in his 80s. So really a remarkable group. Carl Stinson began his military career on Grenier as a Civil Air Patrol cadet. You can see him during those years. I think he's like 16 there. in the 1950s. And then him on the left is actually last month. He came up to the Aviation Museum and he gave a lecture because from Grenier, he enrolled in the Air Force full time, and he worked on the Titan II, what is now the Titan II Missile Silo Museum in Arizona. So basically, he was the guy who, during the height of the Cold War, if the war went hot, he was the man who pushed the button, essentially. So a very, he had a very strange career. I don't envy what he did, but he definitely shed a lot of light on what it was like to be in the military during the height of the Cold War, and it all began at Grenier. And you can kind of see here what Grenier looked like at the end of its life. This was 1967. The Manchester airport went fully commercial once again in 1966, when the remainder of the National Guard troops moved out to Pease. Immediately after the war ended, some commercial aviation came back to the base, but this is when it fully turned over. And things began to kind of just, they look a bit vacant in these photos, but I know for many years a lot of the buildings did remain. They weren't built to last forever. They were put up very quickly as sort of almost emergency housing to house these troops that had to come to the area. And so some of them held up well, some of them degraded rather quickly. But it was also the site where a number of troops served during Vietnam before the final closure of the base. And I think in here I have one last little section about the final years of what was going on here. The 1960s was a time of downsizing across the Air Force as a whole. Grenier, where the engines of hundreds of bombers once hummed, was not immune. When the orders came to close Grenier Air Base, only two tenants remained: the 157th Military Transport Group, which was reassigned to Pease, and the 902nd Troop Carrier Group, which was disbanded. The final drill at Grenier took place in the snow on January 16th, 1966, and the final plane flew out of Grenier on January 19th. The control of the airport was now in the hands of the local government, with the control tower handed over to FAA personnel. Throughout its quarter century of operation, Grenier Air Base was a bit like a train station. It served as a hub where every day people would board transportation elsewhere. They might be traveling along any number of lines to different places. They could go through their days simply traveling to another station or drop something off and return. Other passengers might find themselves much further afield, having boarded ships or found new lines to carry them to places of great danger. The train station in itself was not always the most interesting thing. A train station is, after all, a departure point, a meeting place where people await movement into the unknown. Grenier was such a space, liminal when it was in operation and now completely gone. But the story of all those passengers, all the soldiers, civilians who ran the PX, the local children who biked to the runway and dreamed about flying, those stories don't have to disappear as well. And to just kind of finish this off, if it lets me play it, I'm going to show you what somebody sent me, which is actually from one of those Civil Air Patrol cadets who was at one of the encampments in the 1950s. So you can see Grenier yourself. This came as a bit of a surprise. I had never seen any footage of it before. Now, that's a C-119 boxcar. During the 60s, there was a lot of taking paratroopers up to train. I know that that was happening from Grenier. They would take them out over the mountains or to Chicopee, and they would jump. They would practice jumping. I was also told that the crews actually flying the C-119s were told to stay away from the paratroopers because they were crazy. For a joke, what they would do sometimes is they would, right before they jumped, grab the nearest person and take them out with them. So yeah, I guess they were kind of nuts. Here you can see some of the barracks. Something I did hear a lot from people who spent time on Grenier in the later years was that they genuinely seemed to find it to be a pleasant place. Like, it wasn't unpleasant for them to remember this. And I think that's part of why I didn't meet a lot of resistance in trying to write this book. When people told me about their stories, they wanted to tell them. If they had something that they remembered, they wanted to share it for the most part, because they had good memories of this place, especially in the later years. I have continued to get a lot of stories about Grenier, even though the book is done. And if anyone here has any, I'd love to hear them. I had a man call me just 2 days ago to tell me how when the base was all gone in the 1970s, what did remain, him and his friends as teenagers liked to go and they would hunt for scrap in the different buildings. And at the time, in the area, Sanders Associates, a defense company, had a number of warehouse locations near the base. And I guess they'd had some issues with break-ins. So this guy, he's just a teenager, him and his friends, they're looking around for like copper wires, stuff like that, in abandoned buildings. The cops got called on them by Sanders Associates while they were doing this. And they got arrested for espionage. They did eventually get let go and got to go home to their parents after it was made clear that they were actually just kind of idiots. And I asked him, I was like, okay, did you go back to the base after that, or did you just kind of like learn your lesson and stay home? And he said, oh no, we went back. So he described it as the vacant base seeming almost like a kind of playground to him in the 70s. And I do think it took on that character for a number of people. And I think this project is in part looking at a little bit of that. That was definitely an element for kids who grew up around it. It was like this sense of curiosity about what it was, but also trying to remember the very serious ramifications of what happened earlier.
That was me.
Was it? That was you who was arrested for the espionage?
No, but that was me. That was our playground.
Yeah, I heard that from a lot of people.
There was underground bunkers. We used to keep bombs in, and the barracks and stuff. And there was a lot of industries that started. People would rent those old buildings on the cheap, and they'd start a building, and now they're like really good businesses.
Yeah, the wigwams, or what they were called, to keep the munitions in initially. One thing I didn't talk about too much in this, but honestly could probably be its own book, is the New Boston bombing station out in New Boston. Initially, Grenier didn't really have a place to store munitions in the very early days of the base, and bombs were left out where they should not be. I found one newspaper article from the Union Leader from the 1940s that was titled, "Child Takes Practice Bomb to School," or something along those lines. And New Boston was the outgrowth of creating a space where the bombers could train, where it was isolated, and the topography of the land by Joe English Pond made it an ideal place for this. So that's the end. Thank you all for listening. Is there any questions? I do also have copies of the book with me. If anyone is interested in purchasing them, the proceeds do not go to me, they go to the museum. They benefit our student plane building programs. So if you are interested, we have those available, and I believe the library has two copies.
2 copies, yep, that you can borrow from us. So, yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you.
In the sources that you had available, did you mention the Air Force Historical Research Agency? And all of
I
that?
did. I think I probably mentioned that in here, but I did also contact them. I used records that they did send us and make us available. They did have, it came on CD, a large document of all their records related to Grenier. So they did actually have some. In the 1970s, if I tried to trace individual records, there was a large fire that destroyed a lot of personnel records from the 1940s, particularly related to air combat. So there were a couple of occasions where I reached out, I filed FOIA, Freedom of Information Act requests for certain individuals, and was told, we don't have that, we think it was destroyed in the fire. So yes, that is a good resource for anybody who is trying to do some investigation on military history.
That chapel, you know, Bethany Chapel.
Is that the one in Merrimack?
No. At the top of Newberry Road is a church there. You can see it. It's right next to the base. There used to be the main gate there. The little white church,
Okay. On Bethany Road in Londonderry?
Manchester.
Or in Manchester, over the line?
The only way you
Okay.
can get to it is you go in the airport entrance now. You go around, but when we were kids, you used to come Newberry Road, Brown Avenue, just
Okay, I know where you mean now.
cow path, and you go up, and that was the gate. But that was one of the gates, and a lot of the soldiers would stop in there, and I was told that when the wheels left the ground from Grenier and they went to Gander, then they went to Greenland and Iceland and then to England, that was the last, a lot of these guys, that was the last time they saw the United States.
Yep.
So it must have been pretty, emotional, because the 8th Air Force lost more men in combat than the United States Marine Corps did.
It was considered to be almost sort of a miracle if you got past a certain number of missions. You were almost sort of on borrowed time. If you made it past, I think it was like 24 or so, just,
25, I think.
yeah, just statistically speaking. It was very, very, very dangerous. But I think I know the spot you're talking about now. There was a veteran in the 1980s from the conflict in World War II. He planted a memorial tree, I think, in that area. And I found some documentation in like a letter he wrote in our archive saying that it was planted there because that's where he could watch the bombers come and go. I will end on one last note that I just think is interesting. And I found towards the very end of writing this, there are many things that I could have in this book that unfortunately got left out just because I was on a deadline. I had to eventually finish what I was doing. But I found this autobiography written by a man who flew out of Grenier, and he was a waist gunner on a bomb crew, and he flew overseas and was shot down with his crew. They survived. They went to a POW camp. He survives the full war, comes home to New Hampshire, and tells the whole harrowing story in this autobiography of his. And at the very end of his life, a historian from Germany contacted him and said, "Would you like to come to Germany and meet the man who shot you down?" So he said yes. So if you read the book, there's a little bit of that in there, and that's just a really unusual experience, I think.
What was his name?
His name was Edward Mackenzie. Mackenzie. Unfortunately not with us, otherwise I definitely would have reached out.
Guys would be 100 now.
Yeah. Well, I went to the Tilton Veterans Home when I was writing this, to ask if they had any remaining World War II veterans, and they had 8. But most of them were not combat veterans. They were mainly people who served at the very end of the war. Like they were teenagers and in high school for the duration of it, but were sent to Korea or Japan at the very end of the war. But still gave very valuable perspective, I think, on what it was like to live in New Hampshire while the war was going on.
I think you did a fantastic job with the research.
Thank you very much.
You reminded me of when you said in the 30s they gave the military pilots the responsibility to deliver the mail, and I'd read the biography of Limbaugh, and when he was young he used to deliver the mail in all kinds of weather without instruments and without lights on the ground and so forth. And he was very upset because I think it was Roosevelt. It was that administration that changed the policy. Yeah, you did a great job.
Thank you. And you are correct, it was Roosevelt.
Have you been able to get out to the New Boston Satellite Tracking Station?
I have not. I've been in communication with them. They actually asked us to go out there, like a kind of a contingent from our museum, for a memorial service that they had planned for a pilot who actually died in an accident during World War II, a training accident. But it ended up not coming together, something to do with their scheduling and getting the family together, so I still haven't had a chance to go out there.
The OLLI, the Office of Lifelong Learning, has a year ago or so, had a course, and you could sign up and you go out there.
Oh, cool.
And that was the second time, so occasionally the person who hosted it may do it again. But it provided a tour of certain facilities and a talk, and which was fascinating. And you realize that is a good part of that ground that probably still has buried ordnance.
Oh, yeah.
From dropping
Yeah.
in World War
Yeah,
II.
if they clear brush or something, that's why it's highly restricted. They're finding bombs there. Not all the time, but they very often find, they're clearing brush or taking a tree down, they'll find a bomb that didn't go off or something, so they have to detonate it. And it's pretty interesting. That's why it's restricted, like you just don't want to go out there with your kids. Mom, look what I found.
No,
It's
definitely
like in England,
not.
They're finding bombs all the time, but in Germany.
I think in the early 2000s or 2010s, they actually drained Joe English Pond to see what they could find. And I think it's, I worked with the New Boston Historical Society, asking them about what they had for records, and I think it's on their webpage. You can see what they pulled out of Joe English Pond for the bombs.
Yeah, the tour guide described that before they had let the public come in and they had trails to go around, they did a survey using ground penetrating radar to try to get stuff. That only would have taken the stuff closer to the surface. Other ordnance may be really deep, but they had supposedly cleared out a lot. That's why they ended up with trails, hiking trails that go around. So it's not entirely banned to the public, but yeah, there still is a lot probably there, and because there was so much dropped as a practice range.
That it also has, I only found this out very recently through also OLLI, because I was a speaker and I met another OLLI speaker who told me that his whole lecture is about, and research that he does is about how that site was actually used in the Underground Railroad long before that. So interesting history out in New Boston.
There, that was part, I think it was Underground Railroad. There was a murder there in the 40s or 50s.
In the 50s. It's actually, I have that in here because it does connect to the base.
And when they first opened it, when they first got the base up and running, like 1942, when there was the soldiers that did security at the base was a black company, companies of black soldiers, and people here treated them good, you know what I mean? So they said, people are so friendly up here, but it sure is cold because these guys had to walk the fence. And that was the first time just about anybody in New Hampshire saw black people. I mean, it's in the, I think it's in the history of the Bruder's book. It's like,
You are correct about that, because the newspaper that I mentioned, the Beacon, that we have in our archives, was largely written by that squadron. So I think it's on our website now. It's interesting. You can read their perspective on what it was like being on the base, and there is a lot about how cold it is.
oh yeah. Oh, we're used to it.
So I remember in the mid-50s into the 60s, where my father's office was, you could see the Quonset huts. And I noticed either in the film clip or the still shots, I quickly saw some of those. I take it all or virtually all of that is just gone.
It's gone.
It's totally gone.
Now, what I'm trying to remember is where that was, how far that was from the Almond airport. Now, in my memory, it didn't seem like they were far apart. I think you could walk it.
I think they were close. Part of the difficulty of this for me, as someone who was not alive when Grenier was functional, was trying to take old maps of the base and kind of like correlate, like when people came in and told me about their memories, like, okay, you remember this, was it here or was it here? And even now, I'm kind of like, I have this sort of shifting notion of where exactly things were.
The big thing was, when you come in, you come up from Brown Ave. You come up, I used to ride my bike there when I was a kid, and then when I got to be a grown-up, I used to deliver oil in Londonderry and Derry. That was my route. I did quite a few of those little startup companies, and they're renting the barracks. Again, they're just starting these businesses, you can lease a barracks from the airport authority on the cheap, and the barracks were along beyond where Executive is, going that way, like where UPS and FedEx is.
Okay.
Go all the way around, they were there. But the thing they did was runway where you guys are, was it 35 and 17? That went straight, okay? When they expanded the runway, that pushed Perimeter Road, everything into Londonderry and Pettingill Road, that pushed the whole thing, like where Stonyfield is and FedEx and all that. All the barracks were there, okay? And then it went around along where the hangars are now.
Okay, yeah.
Barracks. And then there was some off of a Perimeter Road behind where the fire station is and where New Hampshire School of Mechanical Trades. You went all along there to about where Cohasset Brook was.
One thing that does still remain is, I wonder if you remember this area in particular at all. Off Akira Way, there is a cement foundation right off the road in the woods, and we've been wondering if that was barracks.
Either that or it was administrative, because the closer, I think the officers and administration was off of Harvey Road in that gate, and the grunts would sleep, the guys that were bivouacking for a few days, they would sleep in the enlisted men's barracks. But the closer, and I think the base commander was in that brick house directly next to the fire station. I think it's building 1000 or something like that. That one, I believe that was where the general or the colonel lived, or whatever it was. And everything else was, because it's changed now, because they lengthened both runways, and they also cut. They used to be the railroad line, because the trains used to go straight along, and that was one of the reasons why they put the base there, was they had rail service there, which was a big deal.
Yeah, and I saw a lot of photos of the train dropping off troops, dropping off various things there. And if you're at our museum, one of the things we're hoping will be there soon is actually the Londonderry Rail Trail, reusing that rail line to go exactly where you're talking about.
On it.
Yeah, they are. We're hoping one day.
But they used to bring the avgas there too, and there was at the northeast end of the airport, there was underground storage tanks for the avgas. And when they were taking them out, one of them actually exploded. in 1970. And my dad responded to that call. He was on the fire department.
Oh, wow.
There was a woman that was killed and 2 guys were pretty much blown out of the tank.
Wow.
The woman was like Miss Londonderry or something. She worked in a little office there.
Oh, I didn't know about that.
Probably 1970 or something like that. So as they were decommissioning the base, a lot of things were happening, you know.
Any other questions?
There was a hangar there, right?
Yes. Actually, I won't go back to it right now, but in the photos you can kind of see the hangar with the tail sticking out.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I asked because I was pretty sure I remembered it, but when I try to remember, I think of the hangar at Pease. Do you know the book? You must know the book on Pease.
Yeah, there's
What, 15, 20, whatever years ago it came out?
yeah,
And highly illustrated.
unless I'm thinking of a different one, there's Granite Wings, which is on the
I
Air
think that-
National Guard.
Yeah. Was that just on the Guard?
That one is just on the Guard.
Okay.
It was produced by them.
Yeah. I have it somewhere, but I haven't seen it for a while.
Okay, well, thank you all so much for coming out on this very rainy day. I hope you enjoyed, and I hope you stop by the museum sometime. Yeah.